Hoy hemos traído una persona que es muy especial para nosotros en Connect, que se llama Greg Horowitz. Greg es una persona que conocimos hace unos años, incluso creo que casi que al tiempo con Gloria, de pronto un poquito antes. Él era el CEO de Global Connect. Connect, para los que no saben, es la red de innovación más grande de Colombia. En este momento somos 54 organizaciones, 24 universidades. Entonces trabajamos en todos los aspectos que tienen que ver con innovación, con acercamiento universidad-empresa, con temas de transferencia, digamos, de las invenciones de las universidades a las empresas, en temas de propiedad intelectual, en metodologías de innovación, en temas de política pública, en temas de cultura, que es muy importante. Y Greg, siendo el CEO de Global Connect, también fue, digamos, testigo de la creación de muchos Connects en el mundo. Hay 40 Connects en el mundo. El primero fue en San Diego, en California, que se creó hace como 20 años, y el capítulo colombiano es el único de América Latina. Y Greg también, Greg ha hecho muchas cosas, es que casi que describir la hoja de vida de Greg es complicado. En este momento él también es socio de un fondo de inversión de Silicon Valley que se llama T2VC. Ellos invierten en emprendimientos innovadores y también hacen consultoría en diferentes partes del mundo. Acaba de estar en Chile, la semana entrante va a Pakistán, ha asesorado como a 40 instituciones, gobiernos de diferentes partes, de 40 países distintos en el mundo. Y está aquí estos 2 días, entonces le dije, oiga, porque yo hace rato quería traerlo al foro, realmente lo que me hubiera gustado es traerlo a una plenaria, porque Greg es un speaker, digamos, que es de la talla, digamos, que hubiera sido interesante para la plenaria del foro, pero pues no lo puedo traer sola, sino que me toca colincharme cuando alguien más lo trae, entonces este es un colinche de alguien más. Entonces, pues sin más preámbulo, les voy a presentar a Greg. Él también fue autor de un libro que salió hace un par de años que se llama The Rainforest, que habla de cuáles son los elementos que durante todos estos años que él lleva trabajando en temas de innovación, él ha encontrado que son los dinamizadores y potenciadores de un ecosistema exitoso en Silicon Valley. Y dice, The Rainforest, what makes Silicon Valley tick? O sea, ¿cuáles son esos elementos que existen allá? Y se hace la pregunta, ¿eso se puede replicar en otros países o no? ¿Cuáles son esos factores que sí quizás se pueden replicar en otros países? Entonces, voy a presentarles, Greg.
Thank you. No, I'm comfortable. A group this size, a large group, it's all fun. In fact, these types of groups are better because we'll leave time for lots of questions, and hopefully we'll be able to have a conversation. I don't know how much of the background she gave you about me, but I'm an entrepreneur from the Silicon Valley. I am also a venture capitalist, but I also spent a lot of time in economic development. But really innovation-based economic development. Of course, living in California, it's difficult to not feel the effects of technology and what the innovation sectors have done. For 17 years, I had worked in very traditional, what we call bricks and mortar businesses, very similar to the businesses that are here in Colombia, and I worked for a gentleman named Warren Buffett on the operating side of companies. So I had a very strong sense of operations, of how to run what we called predict and repeat companies. And with mature companies and with kind of the kinds of companies we had worked with, our business was all about repeatable, scalable, very transparent business models. We came in every day knowing exactly what we were supposed to do, and we were just supposed to do it better and at greater scale than we had done before. In fact, working with Mr. Buffett, it was very, very clear what our job was, particularly on the operating side. Our job was to produce cash efficiently. It was really that simple. The reason he owned a set of operating companies, everything from NetJets to Burlington Northern to Dairy Queen and See's Candies, was because the business models were not only very predictable, but they were also relatively cash efficient. So you can imagine that my eyes were quite opened when I went to the Silicon Valley. And the way I did that was that I was getting restless doing the same thing every day. After 17 years, you tend to get very good at what you're doing, and your pattern recognition is quite good. You walk in every day. But it also becomes less and less of an intellectual challenge. And so my mentor at Berkshire Hathaway funded a small startup in the Silicon Valley that I went and ran, and that was very much a challenge. Because during the 90s in the Silicon Valley, you kind of had to suspend your belief about the way businesses operated, because everyone was telling you that there was a completely new business model that was occurring in Silicon Valley, that the way companies were being created and the way they behaved, the way they grew, and the way they exited was not the way that we had seen before. And that was very confusing. So I made every mistake you could make, and then we got lucky. And we sold our company, as you could do in the 90s in the Silicon Valley. It's much more difficult to do as many mistakes as we made. But one of the lessons that Mr. Buffett always taught me is it's always better to be lucky than smart, and you should know the difference. So believe me, I knew the difference. I was very, very lucky. I then went to work as an entrepreneur in residence for a venture capital fund. And what that meant was that they gave me a desk, they gave me a checkbook, and they told me to go out and find companies to invest in. And the first company we found to invest in was actually a very interesting company. A friend of mine had started it, and we got lucky again. We invested in the company, we took the company public. The company is still around today, does about $3 billion a year of business, and is one of the largest e-marketing or e-commerce companies on the web. Now, what that allowed me to do is it basically gave me some freedom. And it gave me some freedom to explore, things that I wanted to do. So I took some time off, came back to San Diego where I had gone to school. So I graduated from the University of California, San Diego, and began working with the local business accelerator there called Connect. Now, Connect at that point wasn't very, very well known. It was beginning to get well known because there was a professor at Harvard University named Michael Porter who had written a study on what he called clusters of innovation. And Michael Porter was the professor who actually coined the term clusters. And he was writing about different cities, places like Boston and Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas. And one of the cities he wrote about was San Diego. And he said, San Diego is a really interesting place because they have a program there that was almost single-handedly responsible for the growth of the innovation sector there. And so for those of you looking for really interesting models, that could be an interesting one. So you can imagine almost overnight we had a lot of people getting on planes, coming to San Diego, wanting to study what we had done. Because when they went to places like Silicon Valley and Boston, they were very big, organic, heavy models. They had happened over long periods of time, and there were so many different pieces, people couldn't really figure out what the recipe was. They couldn't figure out what it was they wanted to accomplish. So what they did is they would come to San Diego and they found a nice small little town. Even today, the entire metropolitan area of San Diego is only 3 million. The city itself is only 1 million people. So it's not that big. Its industries were very heavy in defense and tourism and real estate historically. And so that was our business. And then with the downsizing after World War II, and then later with the downsizing through the end of the Cold War, a lot of our defense-related industries were getting smaller. In fact, in just a few years, we lost over 100,000 jobs in the sector. And everyone was trying to figure out what our next act was. How are we going to become sustainable? And it was interesting because it was the program that gave eventually birth to the Connect Bogota program, is that one of our local leaders in San Diego came to speak with our chancellor of the university. Now in San Diego, we have one major research university. We have a few universities, but we have one major research university, which is the University of California, San Diego. It's one of the, well, I think it's ranked number 8 research university in the world. And he said, you know, we're going to have to do more in order to be competitive in the future, because we just lost 2 very large federal contracts to the city of Austin, Texas. And these were public-private partnerships which would bring government and industry and academia together. And it was apparent that San Diego had no idea how to do this, because their submission was terrible. And so what our chancellor said is, I think I know what's going on. Now, we were so lucky. Talk about serendipity, because our chancellor had just come from running the National Science Foundation. Before that, he was at Stanford University. So he had had this experience of watching the evolution of what happened at Stanford and MIT, but also at the National Science Foundation. And he said, you know what's different is that in places that have done really well with technology is that there are natural conversations between industry and academia. They rely on each other, because academia is helping solve a lot of big industry problems using technology, and academia requires a lot of this these dollars for sponsored research. So they have this natural conversation. Now, when you look at the birth of innovation and this kind of whole Silicon Valley phenomenon, believe it or not, it all started with defense. This is not only the story in Silicon Valley in California, it was a story in Israel as well. That not only did government come in and fund a lot of the research that was going on, the stuff that was too risky for the private sector to take on, they were also buying all the products that were coming out of the back end. It was just in the middle that the government stepped back and let business do what business does best, which is take ideas and translate them and transform them into the products and services necessary to actually create impact. Technologies don't create impact, it's the businesses, you know, built around them that allows them as a carrier model into the market. And that's what everyone is working on. So what we learned at Connect is we had all these regions coming to us, and they asked us to replicate our model. And what we suspected at the time is you could not just franchise innovation. That just because it worked in San Diego or Silicon Valley or Israel was no guarantee that it would work anywhere else. In fact, I was highly skeptical that it actually would. But I had to prove my hypothesis. Even though I'm not an academic, we still had to prove our hypothesis, which is why we created Global Connect. It was to not only study how innovation happens, how regions like Colombia, like Bogota, make innovation happen or use innovation, but really, what are the key lessons we can then take away and actually replicate? So this presentation we're going to go through is really about what are kind of some of the key lessons we learned over the last 15 years of doing this. And it was our group at the University of California that helped popularize the term innovation ecosystem. And as Marcela mentioned, we wrote a book on this because we saw so many people focusing way too much on building incubators and accelerators and technology parks and thinking, if we just build these things, then we'll become innovative. And what we learned, and hence the title of the presentation, is that 99% of what makes innovation happen is completely invisible. You can't see it, you can't touch it. In many cases, you can't even feel it. It's all around you. So when people come to California, and whether they come to San Diego or they come to Silicon Valley and they visit Stanford University or they visit Facebook and Google, and they kind of watch with it and then they try to take that back and implement it home, that's less than 1% of actually what makes innovation happen. And so we're going to talk about what the other 99% is in this presentation. So the fundamental question, whenever I write, I always start by asking a question. And that question for this particular book was, why is innovation actually so hard? I went to several of my colleagues, like Michael Porter, like Clay Christensen at Harvard, and said, you've been writing about innovation for almost 20 years. And if you've been writing about this stuff for over 20 years, why do you think more of it's not happening? You seem to have figured it out. People have bought your books. People have taken it back and tried to implement what you've told them to do, and yet it's still not happening. So there's got to be something missing. The other thing is, even if we know what makes innovation happen, how do we make more of it happen? And why do we fail to implement the knowledge that we actually do get once we find it? So we have all the knowledge. We commission reports. We bring in experts to talk to us. Let me move out of the way. We bring in experts to talk about innovation, and yet even after we have all this knowledge, we see so many places around the world doing nothing with it, or doing very little with it. And there's a reason why innovation is so hard, is because a colleague of mine who actually answered this question for me, or actually he refused to answer this question for me, and he gave me a book which answered the question, and the book was called The Knowing-Doing Gap by Pfeffer and Sutton. And it said, there's a big difference between knowing what to do and actually doing it. And as a quick story, in San Diego, my own economic development corporation brought me in and said, we'd like to hire you to help us develop a strategic plan using your methodology for the city of San Diego. The first thing I said is, why don't you share with me the plans you've put together over the last 10 years? They shared these plans with me, and I said, okay, walk me through what you've actually done in these plans. And what we very quickly learned, the city did not have a planning problem. They had an actual doing problem. They had commissioned actually 8 economic development plans over the last 12 years, and they had failed to implement 90% of it. So again, it wasn't a planning problem, it was a doing problem. But the reason that there's a disconnect between knowing what to do and doing it is because knowing what to do sits up here, doing is in your fingertips, but something very interesting happens in between this. We actually translate, human beings are unusual creatures in that we're actually connected to each other through our empathy and our humanity, but it's our emotional centers that actually guide our behaviors. Even though we can think something and know something, we eventually have to translate it into what we feel we should do, and then we're compelled by what our belief systems and what our feelings are, and that's what gets us to do something. And we realized that there was a disconnect between this, that although people knew what they had to do, they weren't really feeling it and they weren't doing it. And so we came up with this model called the rainforest to actually explain that. And the best way to describe that is we looked at traditional industry systems, these economic models, these predict and repeat models that I was telling you about, and these are the models really of industrial society. They also represent the agrarian societies too, where we came from. And we called this the rise of the industrial economies, these were all built around models of scarcity. The reason we formed the agrarian cultures is because our collective knowledge allowed us to make better use of the resources we had at our disposal. If we could kind of combine resources, which included our knowledge and our talent, we could waste fewer of our resources, and therefore we could get better productive output. And we realized that these models were highly linear in nature, which is why we call them plantation models or farm models. Now, this happens to be a vineyard in the Silicon Valley, but the first thing you notice about this is how linear it is. The other thing you notice is that the minute you look at these systems, you know exactly what they are designed to do. You know why they exist. And of course, you notice the linearity. There's almost a beauty in how organized they are. And there's a reason that they're organized this way, is because they waste the fewest amount of resources. If we're going to run irrigation lines, we run them very straight down here, because if we ran them all this way, we'd be wasting not only lines, but we'd be wasting water. And we have very predictable outcomes because all of our knowledge goes into the engineering of the outcome. We hire people who are really, really good and expert at planting, at harvesting, at cultivating these. The problem with this is if a weed ever grows up in our plantation, we actually pull it out because it's not supposed to be there. In fact, it actually competes for the very resources we're trying to preserve. And so we measure our outcomes based on our productivity, yield, efficiency. You've heard all these words, and this has been basically the model of the 20th century. And we've replicated this linear model over and over again, whether it's the way we manufacture cars or the military industrial complex, or even today the way we make chips. And there's an underlying theme to these conversations. And what we teach our students in school, what we teach our workers in the workplace, is that your job is to not make mistakes. We're hiring you because you have a skill and a capability You will waste the fewest number of resources. You are an expert. Therefore, we want you to do things as perfectly as possible because that will affect our bottom line. But we saw another competing model emerging. When we went to places like Silicon Valley and Israel, we noticed something different, something that was in direct contrast to what we were seeing in these kind of linear production industrial societies. The first thing we noticed is the overall mindsets were different. The mindsets were based not on scarcity, not on the fact of we have very few resources, let's not waste them. It was built on mindsets of abundance. There's plenty here for all of us. And a way to explain this is in the plantation model. If I have an apple and you have an orange, and we decide we're going to somehow share that apple and orange, no matter what we do in terms of slicing it, we'll initially have an equivalent of an apple and orange. We can't do anything more with it than what we've got. But what's even worse is once we begin consuming that apple and orange, we take the capacity down to 0. So we're very careful about how we allocate. We allocate based on fairness, about utility, all these normal thoughts. But when you and I get together for coffee, or we get together in a setting like this to have breakfast and share these ideas, and if I have an idea and you have an idea, and we share those ideas, we now each have 2 ideas. In fact, after we talk or we do this presentation, I hope we're going to have lots of ideas. And what's interesting is when we walk out of this room, we will have increased the knowledge than we came in with. So actually, the level goes to infinity as opposed to 0. And this is quite interesting because Matt Ridley had written in his book, he's an evolutionary biologist and a sociologist, and he wrote that innovation is all about ideas having sex. If we can get ideas together, if we can, rather than engineering process, if we can engineer serendipity and just get ideas colliding, we can make a lot more innovation happen. And we call these models rainforests. Now, it's a metaphor, obviously, but it's actually closer because I am a biologist by training and by background, and this was a way for me to explain to others what we were seeing. Is that in those other industrial systems, we assume that they're highly static and configured, whereas in biological systems, they're constantly in motion. In fact, when you look at this, if I ask you what the product is in this scene versus the plantation scene, you won't know. You know it's very lush and green and it's diverse and it looks really beautiful, but you're not sure what's going on here. In fact, the rules of chaos and complexity rule this system. The rules of order and simplicity are all about the plantation. And so what's interesting about this model, if I say, what is the most important thing in the rainforest? The thing that will probably have the greatest impact, the thing that will probably change our lives for the better. And the answer is probably the weeds we're standing on. Now in the first model, we pull the weeds out. In this model, we have to understand what those weeds represent, because that very thing you're standing on is the thing that will probably disrupt and change the way we live and work. And this is not only the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. In fact, Kathy Koo at Stanford University, every year, she runs technology transfer. She's been there 28 years. Every year, she has her licensing officers write down what they think is going to be the next big technology. The one that's not only going to disrupt and create a new market, but things that are just going to change existing markets. She said in 28 years, they've never gotten it right. Everyone thought Google was stupid. They thought companies like Yahoo, Sun Microsystems, were never going to be much, or that they were just quite ordinary. She said they've never gotten it right. And this is one of the first key lessons I'm going to teach you. You absolutely cannot pick the winners. It is not possible to pick the big winners. You can pick the small winners because they improve, they're incremental. But the true disruptive players, you won't be able to pick. In fact, if I asked you, does this look like a startup? Or is this the kind of people you would invest in? If they walked into your office, would you give them millions of dollars? And most people would say no. This is a young Bill Gates and his team. And there's a wonderful movie that if you ever get a chance, it's on Netflix, you can rent. It's called Something Ventured. And it's about the history of the Silicon Valley as told through the eyes of the venture capitalists. But what's interesting is there's an interview in there with a gentleman named Arthur Rock, who was one of the founders of the venture capital industry. He was the one who actually invested in Apple Computer. But he talks in the interview about the first time Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak walked into his office. He said they were arrogant, they were dressed funny, they had long hair, and Steve Jobs smelled really bad. And they didn't wear shoes. Now, if those kind of people walked into your office asking for millions of dollars, telling you that they were going to put a ding in the universe and change the way we fundamentally lived our lives, and that they were going to eventually create the most profitable company on the planet, you would have laughed. Because not only did their ideas sound crazy, but they don't look like leaders. They don't look like people who can disrupt. So how do we build systems that can spot genius, that can spot potential, that can spot the next great thing? And that's what our work has really been obsessed with, is what does a leader really look like? We know what the old leaders look like. They're very charismatic. They can control a crowd. They can allocate resources very efficiently. Mr. Buffett used to tell me that the most important trait that any of his executives must have is the ability to allocate resources. But a vision-led company, as we saw with what happened when John Sculley replaced Steve Jobs, they tend to fall apart. Vision-led organizations are very different than product-led or predict and repeat-led. So therein lies the paradox of innovation. This is one of the truisms that will hit us pretty hard. And that is, innovation is only measured once the market begins imitating it. Once it begins sharing it is when innovation happens. And yet, we're all trying to pick innovation at the beginning. You can't. In fact, here's another rule, is you cannot make innovation happen. You can only increase the chances that it happens. And so what the conversation is how do you increase the chances that innovation happens? That the kinds of outcomes we want that will change the world will actually happen. And again, these are very kind of conflicting ideas, because we all desire creativity. In fact, there was a wonderful study that was done that showed we all will say that we desire creativity and novelty and new products. But yet, when we actually present these new ideas to people, they're afraid of them. The market almost always rejects creativity when it's actually presented, while they say in their mind they desire it. When it gets to here, they actually reject it, because it scares us. It represents a potential change. We're going to have to do things differently than we were doing before. And history is fraught with these ideas. Whether it was, the folks at Western Union saying that the telephone will never have any utility. Whether it was, and these are the leading experts of the day, whether it was Lord Kelvin, who was head of the Royal Society, basically said, you will never be able to fly. Or even more recently, whether you have Ken Olsen of DEC, one of the most important computer companies, saying there will be no reason for anyone to have a personal computer. We see this repeated over and over again through history. And so what we've learned is that actually imagination is a lot more important than knowledge. So when we have young kids in school, their world is consumed with imagination. It's what their whole world is. As we get older and older and we go to school, we begin pushing that imagination out and we begin filling it with knowledge. So we begin then relying on our knowledge to solve our problems and to act in the world. And that can be very good in a lot of cases. But when we want to solve new problems, particularly what Einstein said is you can't always solve new problems with the same thinking that helped create them. And that's why places like Silicon Valley that embrace a lot of creativity, that have a lot of creative geniuses, actually outperform those of the more traditional mindsets. Because if you go to the experts, you're going to get iterations on their existing thinking. If you go to the creatives, they're going to think quite differently. So remember when we said that when I hire people in a traditional industrial company, I don't want them to make any mistakes. When I hire people in a creative company like Google, what I want them to do is, can you solve a problem? In fact, the job, when you go in for an interview at Google, part of the job interview is they give you a problem, several problems to solve. But they give you a big problem to solve and they make you stay there until you solve it. And some of the people have to stay there 1 or 2 days to actually solve it before they can finish the interview. So that's kind of very typical of this process. I want people who know how to solve problems, because as we go forward, the knowledge we're going to need to solve some of the problems doesn't yet exist, And so we're just going to have to begin experimenting until we get it right. So I need people who can figure out how to solve things as opposed to people who just don't make any mistakes. And what Edison has said, it's not that he's failed, he's just found 10,000 ways not to do something. That's the mindset that we try to encourage in our entrepreneurs. It's not so much, don't worry about failing, it's about figuring out how to do it and what that knowledge of failure represents. So this is another reality. So this is the next big lesson. All innovation is actually human-centric. It's not technology or machine-centric. Machines only help us do something better. So eventually all innovation starts with people. And so with governments, with organizations, with companies such as yourselves, we all want a set of outcomes that we're trying to develop. And we're always asking ourselves, okay, what are the actions we have to engender in order for the outcomes? So we want more jobs, we want greater profits, we want greater efficiency. So what do we have to do to get that? And that is generally where we focus. We focus on the actions necessary to drive the outcomes. We want more job, or we want more innovation. Maybe we have to build incubators, or maybe we have to create venture funds. But what we learned is that's not very sustainable. What we realize is that actually our actions are a set of behaviors, our behaviors are a set of attitudes and motivations and all this kind of soft, abstract wording. But eventually what it came to is that everything came down to our belief system. And that was a big epiphany for me, because when I went to Silicon Valley and Israel and San Diego and all these innovation centers, what I found was fundamentally different. Wasn't that they had smarter people or that they had better systems. They just had a different belief system. What people got up every morning thinking and believing and sharing was just quite different. The fact is, if you go to a coffee shop anywhere in the Silicon Valley, you'll overhear 100 other conversations about innovation and people just randomly sharing their ideas. Other places we go to say, I can't share my idea with you because if I share it with you, you're going to steal it. You're going to take it and you're going to use it against me. In the Valley, they just don't even have those ideas. Their ideas, if it was that easy to take an idea or steal an idea, then we'd have a lot more innovation. It's really on the execution side that's really mattered. So this is where we need to focus. Now, the other reason this was a big epiphany, because I've figured this is where my work would focus. This is where we would try to understand. Because if I could figure out how to change the belief systems of a community, then I could get more innovation. Again, I can't make innovation happen. I can just increase the chances that it was happening. So what we realize is that when you find people who believe, if you can find others who believe the same thing you do, no evidence is actually necessary. But if you find people who don't believe you, no evidence will ever suffice. This is the classic argument in religion and politics and everything else. You know, and so really what you're trying to do is you try to gather yourself with people who believe. In one of the case studies I did, I wrote a paper on the religion of Apple. And as I said at the beginning, I always start by asking a question. And the question was, how did Steve Jobs get everyone in the world to act like his employee without having to put him on the payroll? Why is it that people who own Apple products approach it with the same religious zeal that the employees inside the company do, and sometimes even greater? They defend their products and they will actually get quite angry. Why is that? And when I wrote this paper, some colleagues at Amazon had read it and they called me up and they said, that's it. And the question is how do we get that? Because we've got a pretty great company too. Our customers like us, but Apple customers love them. What's the difference between like and love? And how do you actually make that happen? And so we understood is if you look at the early ad campaigns for Apple computers, 1984 campaign and the Think Different campaign, you can go back on YouTube and watch those. What was really interesting about both of those advertising campaigns is never once did they ever mention the product. They only mentioned what their belief system was. If you think different, if you're outside looking in, if you want something a little bit unusual in your life, if you're counterculture, we think we have a product for you. And people bought into their belief system, and their products were merely the manifestation of their belief system. That's why highly successful companies, people follow them, particularly those ones that have longevity, have a belief system that people follow, not just a set of products, because products can be displaced. So we often think, so once I understood what does it take to believe, I kept hearing when I would go to places and saying, why do you think you're not successful? People said, we don't have a culture of risk. Everyone's fearful about taking these things on because the risk can be costly to us. And so we always thought that fear was the most compelling emotion you could have. We don't do things because we're afraid of them. Now remember at the beginning I told you the connection between the heart, the mind, and the fingers? Human beings are the only abilities with creating what are called future memories. We can think about the future, and we can think differently in the present about a future that has not yet happened. It's kind of cool, because it's the same reason that you can tell your children that if they're really good, you'll take them to Disneyland the following week. And amazingly, their behavior changes. Why would their behavior change for something that hasn't even happened yet? Well, they created a future memory of what it's going to be like, but they began feeling differently in the moment. It's what happens all the time when we dream, when we as adults buy lottery tickets. There's no intellectual reason to buy a lottery ticket. But in the moment we buy that lottery ticket and we hold it in our hands, we immediately begin thinking differently about the future. And we imagine about all the great things we're going to buy. And that makes us feel differently. So we often don't do things because we're afraid of them. We're not going to have a conversation with our spouse because we already know what they're going to say and they're going to be disapproving and they're going to yell and be disappointed, so I'm just not going to say anything. So it's part of our ability to create future memories that are negative, but we can also create future memories that are quite positive. And hope is actually a more compelling emotional state than fear. It's actually what they teach prisoners of war to do. As long as you can imagine a different future, you can feel differently, and that will be enough to allow you to thrive and to get beyond. And that's exactly what happens in the Silicon Valley. People wake up every day believing something different, and they believe in more hope than they do fear. They are not risk seekers. Everyone thinks entrepreneurs are risk seekers, that they like risk. They absolutely are not. They're just enormous opportunity seekers, and they feel that what their job is to manage risk. So they see hope that's beyond what they're doing. So it's really the thinking, when we can connect the thinking and the feeling, that then comes the believing. And it's that belief system that our work has been around. In fact, the new book is called The Religion of Innovation. And it's all about how do you kind of create these cultural elements that drive it. Even our leadership models have changed. You know, we need to move from what we call egosystems to ecosystems. And what that really means is that in traditional plantation economies, we have these hierarchical pyramidal structures. And trust me, they're fine. They work very, very well when you're trying to allocate scarce resources, because the person at the top has more knowledge, hopefully, than the person at the bottom. So they make smart allocation decisions. And wherever you are in that status in that hierarchy, you know. It's command and control. These are military models. These are not hard to get your head around. And everything is about title and role. But what we're finding is that in innovation organizations, they work more off of what we call an ecosystem model. And the best way for me to describe this is when you go to a play and you go and you're in the audience watching the play unfold, every actor in that play has an equal but important role. Yes, some actors have greater lines, they have bigger names, but when that actor who is in the moment steps on their line and is delivering it, at that moment they're the most important person in that play. In fact, if they screw up, they mess up the whole play, regardless of who the other names are. So it's important to understand that this is a function of timing rather than title. So everyone's really important. It's just a matter of who does what and the roles that they play. And this is a model that we were working on with the actual US Navy SEALs. So most parts of the military actually operate this way because they don't want people getting killed who don't have enough knowledge. They want to make sure that the generals and the people at the top, and the admirals, are able to allocate the resources. They make a decision and then they keep control of the system through this. But the US Navy SEALs can't do that. If they're being transported into bin Laden's compound, they have to be able to make decisions on their own without having to go back up a hierarchical chain. And so they go in based on what their both their timing and their role is. So the outcome of this particular part of the conversation is, please don't think like an economist. You can't think about just numbers and cents. You have to think more like a psychologist. That it's really, If you can get inside the heads of people and figure out how to get them more excited and engaged, you will get better outcomes from your doing. In fact, what Maya Angelou said is that long after people remember what you say or do, they're going to remember how you made them feel, which is really the whole point of marketing campaigns and the way companies like Google and Facebook and other high innovation organizations work, is they want to make it a great place to work, and they want people to feel good about working. What's different about the millennials and the Gen X, Ys, and Zs coming into the marketplace is they care a lot more than a paycheck. They want to know what the purpose is. They want to feel like they're contributing somewhat to the world. And so you better give them an opportunity, because guess what? The rules of engagement have changed in the world. These new millennials have choices about where they work and how they work. They can work at home in their bathrooms if they decide, and they can be sitting here in Bogota, but working with people in Bangalore. Doesn't really make any difference to them. So the question for every government, the question for every company is, how am I going to compete for the best talent? What am I going to do to make sure that I have absolutely the best? And this is the question very heavily on the minds of Facebook, Google, the big innovation organizations that we work with. This is the question that is almost top of their mind. The people are the most important intellectual property, not the technologies and widgets they produce. Now, here's something that's hard to get your hand around, and that in order to make innovation happen, there's a set of conditions. As remember, we said we can't make innovation happen, we can just increase the chances that it happens. Well, the way you can increase the chances is by creating an optimum set of conditions and then pushing on the system in the right way. Well, in order to create the optimum set of conditions, yes, you have to have trust, you have to have collaboration, all these highly abstract words that really mean that we've got to do things differently. But ultimately, you have to be comfortable with ambiguity and being a little uncomfortable, because the future hasn't revealed itself yet. It's the same reason that we're afraid of it, is because we don't like things that we don't know. So much of it just hasn't revealed itself. But entrepreneurs are fine with ambiguity. We're fine with not knowing everything, knowing that if we just kind of get out there and do agile development, that we will make it happen. And by the way, don't be afraid of pissing people off. This is the amount of impact you're actually able to generate in a company is directly proportional to the number of people you probably upset. This is an example that we'd put together following some conversations around Uber. I am an investor in Uber, and when I had brought this to my business partner as an idea to invest in, he thought it was the dumbest idea he had ever heard. He said, for the following reasons, he said, the minute you introduce a private ride-sharing company, every taxi cab company, every union, anyone who has any vested interest in it is just going to squash you like a cockroach. They're going to do everything they can to make sure you never succeed. And I'm going, I love it. That's exactly what you want. In fact, if you look at almost every disruptive technology, particularly those technologies, one of the greatest trends in innovation is democratization. Things where you take things away from being asymmetric, power that has been held in the hands of the few, and put it in the hands of the many. The many will almost always win out, unless you have unexpendable resources or you have some kind of political climate that keeps you from doing it. But we love our democratization technologies, whether it's Google, which democratized information, eBay, which democratized the process of purchasing in flea markets, Square for micropayments, or Uber for ride sharing. The other thing you have to get comfortable with is that the best people to help you solve your problem are those people who are uninformed but intelligent. That if you always only bring experts in the room to help you solve your problems, the best you're going to do is just get iterations upon their existing thinking. That's the best you're going to be able to get. But if you bring people with different viewpoints and different experiences, they're going to be able to solve a lot. As an example of this, there's a gentleman, Richard Saul Wurman, who's the founder of TED. Do most of you know what the TED conferences are? So TED is a conference where people get up and give talks, and you can watch them online, and it's become an entire movement globally. And now they have micro-TEDs, which are TEDx's. And it's become such a movement. But what the founder of TED told me is the most interesting part of it was not the experts up on stage. It's after they got off stage, and it was the random conversations that happened when Bill Clinton was having a conversation with the cellist Yo-Yo Ma, and Frank Gehry was there, the architect. And they'd have random conversations about something that they were not experts in, But the outcome of that conversation was absolute brilliance. It was intellectual jazz. And that's what really produces a lot of the great ideas and insights that come. So don't always try to put the experts in the room, and don't always surround yourself with people. Because what we find with these entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg and others, it's not that they think outside the box. For them, the box doesn't exist. When we talk to the youth of today and we talk to the people in schools, we try to get the kids realizing that there just is no box, you know, when they solve a problem. In fact, there's a wonderful experiment that people can do, and it was an experiment where they brought a group of engineers in to solve a problem, and a group of kindergartners, so young children in. And they gave them sticks and marshmallows, and they asked them to build this tower. And the kindergartners actually built it quicker, because what all the engineers did is they began assigning tasks, and you're going to be the project manager, and you're going to design it, and you're going to tell us what to do and everything. And the kids just began putting stuff together, and they just kept iterating so quickly up to what they wanted to do. So we created a set of rules, what we call rules of the rainforest. These are kind of the codes by which we live by, but they're basically cultural underpinnings of what it takes to actually make innovation happen. One is you have to be able to break rules. It's about being a little naughty. Entrepreneurs never walk down the center of the road. They're always a bit naughty. They don't necessarily break the laws, but they know how to bend them a little bit. They know how to change them. You always have to be opening doors. You have to be open. You're paying it forward. You're having these kind of conversations. Trust has to be an absolute condition. But these words trust in and of themselves don't really mean a lot. What trust really means is we have to be candid with one another. We have to be able to say things to one another that we might feel a little uncomfortable saying. And there may be some emotional residue, but really the quality of that trust is going to be built by how we handle those candid conversations, not in the fact that we're having them. And of course, my favorite one is number 5, which is really about seeking fairness. Now, when I worked in private equity, it was all around gaining advantage over the person I was competing with. Buying low, selling high. In the innovation model, it's not about buying low and selling high. Again, in private equity, when we invested in companies, we were all investing in things that were very transparent. We knew cash flows and budgets, and we knew customer pipelines and invoices and receivables. All that stuff was easily calculable. When we invest in a startup, like a Jobs and Wozniak walking into our office, really what we're investing in is the potential of an idea and the potential of people to actually make it a reality. And so our job is really trying to figure out what that potential looks like, as opposed to something else. And the only way it works is if we seek fairness, not advantage, because we've found absolutely that when you try to do an advantage model, it never works out. So there's always this battle between order and chaos. People think that it's about building a rainforest or building a plantation. It's about having industrial corporations that dominate the market or having innovation organizations that do. It's not an either or. You actually need both pieces. You need to find ways of creating creative organizations that push and prod the system. And you still need larger organizations to help take those ideas and be able to scale them up and put them into the market. And it's really figuring out what that combination is. How do you kind of foster more startups? How do you get more of these activities? But really, how do you get them to play nicely with many of the companies, you know, that you guys represent, when you can take these things and predictably scale them? So this quote around without order, nothing can exist, which is what a lot of the industrial companies in, but with chaos, nothing can evolve. You can't get better. And what we think we've really kind of found the magic to in places like the Silicon Valley is a way to get both of these things to coexist in a very beautiful way. Now we can actually take questions and talk more about this if you want. In the first place, Springboard. And to be honest, Springboard didn't even start until 10 years after Connect has started. But what we were finding is that the very first programs that Connect did were programs called Meet the Researcher and Meet the Entrepreneur, where we brought these crazies in to talk to people such as yourself. And the first thing that we heard as feedback from the business owners is, why should we care about this? How does this affect us? Why does this matter? Why should we be paying attention? Plus, so many of these people you're bringing before us are just these geeky academics with, you know, wild technological ideas, but we build businesses. We don't build technologies. So what we realized is that we needed a program to help translate what was basically technological opportunity into business opportunity, which is, even if you can create a wonderful widget, the question is, how are we going to create a business around it so it can actually have impact, either social or economic impact? And that's really what Connect was. Now, the reason Springboard then became a program is because we realized that very often these innovators weren't natural entrepreneurs, or if they were entrepreneurs, they needed skill sets that they hadn't gotten through business school or their traditional education. As an example, in traditional MBA programs, so I teach in our business schools at both Stanford and UCSD, and we teach them all the right things about how to do traditional case studies and how to create budgets, but startups don't live and die by budgets. They live and die by cash flow. Who teaches how to manage cash flow in school? So these are a lot of things. Business schools are wonderful teaching people how to write business plans. I've never seen a startup that has ever successfully executed on an original business plan. It's what Sun Tzu said in The Art of War. No battle plan ever survives first contact with the enemy, ever. The only thing you really have is a startup, and Steve Blank said this, that really what a startup is, which is different than a big business. A big business is an organization that executes a repeatable, scalable business model. A startup is an entity searching for a repeatable, scalable business model. And so what organizations like Connect do is, one, they help entrepreneurs or potential or innovators and creators think about how their application might be created into a business, how it might have impact, and how you might scale it. Two is, when you do have a business that has promise, how to help accelerate that, how to help them with customers, how to help them with investors, how to help them with strategic partners, how to basically help them build their teams. These are all things that a lot of these young entrepreneurs haven't had the life experience of. And that's why mentorship is absolutely critical. It's one of the most critical elements of the success of the Valley. And if you look at one of the trends in the Silicon Valley, is that when people have success, they don't leave and buy a beach house and they're never heard from again. They come back in and they do not one or two companies, they do 10 and 15 companies. And it's not only when they put their money back in the companies, but they mentor and they spend their time engaging with these companies. And it's that knowledge. And the knowledge, of course, helps them make fewer mistakes, because they can say, don't do that, I did it, trust me, it doesn't work out. But it's the collective wisdom of a community. And so organizations like Connect are absolutely critical because, one, they help build the technology literacy of a community. So when people sit around coaching and participating in the various panels, it's not one-sided. It's not about them just giving their knowledge to that entrepreneur. Trust me, what they learn from all the other people around the table is of equal or greater value than what they're actually giving that individual entrepreneur. If you add up the billable hours of expertise in a room during a Springboard, it's in the thousands of dollars per hour of advice that these entrepreneurs are getting. But guess what? Every person sitting around the table is getting value back for that. One, they're building new relationships. People that they're going to probably do their next deal with. They may or may not do a deal with this company in front. I can almost guarantee they probably will do business with someone around the table. Two, they're learning the most interesting technology and innovation trends. So as you kind of explore and as you give critical feedback in a Springboard setting to these companies, you're basically hearing about what the state of the art is, not only in the individual technology, but what's happening in trends in the world. What are the most important innovations that are going on? Not just here in Colombia, but what's happening in the US, what's happening in Israel, what's happening around the rest of the world. Three, it's very social for a lot of these people. You know, they like it because they build new friendships as well. And the last one is people feel like they're giving back to their community. They're doing something. And we find that this notion of it's not really charity, but the idea of paying it forward, giving back at the same time as learning is a very sustainable model, which is why it's been replicated in so many places. And that's why it's critical for all of you to participate, whether you participate as an expert on a panel or whether you just participate in one of the networking programs that they do. These things are really critical because it actually helps you One, in your own business, because you gain new connections. Two, one of the applications of innovation is to modernize existing industries, is to figure out how existing businesses can remain competitive and can kind of take it to the next level. Because even if you're a dominant predator in your own industry, even if you're a monopoly or very close to it, in your own industry, at some point something will displace you. It's what Clay Christensen at Harvard calls the innovator's dilemma. There will be a shift in equilibrium, and someone will displace you. And it will almost always come out of your blind side. You'll never see it coming. What these kinds of processes allow you to do is to increase your peripheral vision so that you have less chance of being blindsided.
Your idea that the more that you can make somebody react, the stronger the conversation, maybe possibly even the more aggressive conversation brings out the best in people. And it's such a disruptive idea because most of our education is based on sort of having good relationships and being very open to other people's ideas and not challenging and not giving them sort of strong feedback and whatever is very strong. And my question is, how can you make, because in my particular case I've had many situations in which many of the people that are with me tend to, not always, but they sometimes just go out and walk out and leave the room and whatever. So I've lost a person, and so how to carry out this proposal with maximum benefit.
But the question is, first of all, it's not an either or, as I was saying before, because there are times when basically kind of the political correctness, the politeness, serves a purpose. It doesn't serve us very well in the innovation or a creative space. And the reason for that is because it's actually in the areas of conflict or in the areas of disagreement that the greatest ideas actually surface. It's only when things collide that you actually go beyond the existing thinking. What will end up happening is if you just have the traditional conversation, you'll either get a strong voice, usually you get a strong personality in a room, and that theme will then get picked up by others, and then people will begin joining what we call herd mentality. But in terms of how to do it is what you're asking. How do you create it? We create what are called safe to fail experiments. You have to create safe environments in which it's okay to fail. A book that I would recommend you read on the subject is called Creativity, Inc. Creativity, Inc. I-N-C. And it's written by the founder of Pixar. Because you're finding more of these, what we call schizophrenic organizations. And what I mean by schizophrenic is that one side of the company is all about creative and big ideas and illustrators and animators and storytellers. And the other side of the business is you've got people who have to produce a movie. They've got to turn it out on time, on budget. They have to deal with customers. They have to deal with the markets. And how do you kind of get both sides of those businesses to actually work well together? So they realized that one is you had to have an environment to which to have these open conversations where you could be candid with one another. But they made it a very safe place to do that. One of the things they instituted was what was called the brain trust. And what the brain trust does is it goes between both sides of the business, but they have no authority. In other words, they can come in and listen and give you advice on what you're supposed to do, and you can totally ignore it. And there's absolutely no repercussions if you ignore it. You find the best people to kind of sit on this brain trust, but they have absolutely no authority. It's called influencing without authority. And the reason that it works well is because, in fact, they refused to let Steve Jobs sit on this committee. Steve Jobs is one of the people involved with Pixar. They refused to let him sit on it because if Steve Jobs had an opinion on what you should do, everyone heard that as an order that you should do it. So the way they got it comfortable for people to have disagreements is by making it safe to have a disagreement. Two, once they made it safe, then people allowed themselves to become more vulnerable, because people will become more vulnerable when they feel they're not being judged. And the way we feel we're not being judged is if there's no direct repercussion for that feeling. And so, again, it's not one of these soft things, but it's like an Italian family. You can disagree and yell at each other and stomp your feet and go, okay, let's go have a meal. If you go inside these companies, it is exactly like that. I've been in several of these conversations where we'll be yelling and leaning in and patting the table, and we're going, okay, let's go have lunch. And if you can get to that, it's pretty amazing. What you don't want to have happen, a lot of people think the opposite of love and harmony and all this stuff is hate. It's actually not. It's apathy. When you get people in a room who just no longer care, they're on their Blackberries and they're disconnected, that's the worst thing you could have happen. The disagreement is not the worst thing you could have happen. If you have disagreement, that means people are at least engaged. You have to manage the process, and there are ways of managing the process. But that's a very healthy sign. Begin worrying when people just kind of sit there and don't participate or are on their Blackberries or their cell phones. That's a bad sign. What? It is. In fact, there's a group at Stanford actually studying that. What they did is, there was a very famous study that was done by a researcher in Washington by the name of Gottman, and he was studying married couples going through counseling. But what he found is he could turn the sound off on the videotape, and just by watching their expressions, predict with very high accuracy which couples would be successful in counseling and which ones weren't, by their body language. A researcher at Stanford did that with entrepreneurial teams. He just studies and he watches the body language. You can immediately tell which teams will be successful and which ones weren't by how their body language. As soon as I begin reacting where I'm rolling my eyes and I'm kind of doing this, that's not a good sign. When I'm leaning in and yelling at you, that's a good sign. And then again, how you manage it. But don't be afraid of conflict. It's good stuff. Now, of course, you don't want it all the time. And you have to have mechanisms by which you fight and then you go play. But you make it safe. That's the real secret. And the reason that Connect has been so successful, not only in San Diego, but in places like Bogota and other communities, is because really what they've done is they've created a safe place for entrepreneurs to fail. Because everyone around the table who's offering advice to these companies, every one of those people wants you to succeed. If they're giving advice, they want you to succeed. They're not there to tear you down. We call it constructive deconstruction. The only reason they're tearing you down is so you can be better. And once you feel that love, once you feel that, you begin letting go a little bit. You begin getting less defensive. You begin listening. And you cut down your defenses, you begin listening better. That's a good sign.
In the story about Connect, you have a lot of people, a lot of managers who are involved in Connect in a way that is so nice, that it's sometimes difficult to convince people that you have to give back to the community. How do you can sensibilize people to understand that when you give back to the community, at the end you're receiving? We find it difficult to convince people here to give up their time, to help these entrepreneurs to give this step.
We've used the word religion several times, and my new book is kind of called The Religion of Innovation. When you're starting a new religion, or when you have a new religion, you don't go and begin preaching to people who already have religion and try to convince them that they've got to adopt a new religion. You're going to waste a lot of energy. So one of the ways, or the best way to do it, is don't tell them, show them. So rather than tell someone how it's in their best interest and you've got to pay it forward, don't tell them. Invite them in. Have them sit on a panel. Even if they don't give advice, just say, hey, we'd love for you to observe this stuff. We'd love for you to come by and do it. No cost. You know, you can come by and observe something. And then once they see it and they feel it, and someone that they trust, because believe it or not, although knowledge is transferred best by experts, trust is transferred by peers. So when they can kind of interact with their peers, that's when they're going to get it, not from you. Absolutely. Here's another piece of advice. Don't try to boil the ocean. Which means, if you go into a university or your organization, the goal is not to get everyone in the organization to think differently. That isn't important. The question is if you've got 10% of the people in your organization who care about this stuff, figure out how can we make sure that these 10% actually have the tools, whether they're intrapreneurs, people who are very entrepreneurial inside your organization, who have ideas that you want them, who want to develop them, or because it's very viral. It's like a virus that gets caught. The best way to do it is to find a small group of people who actually believe, again, have the religion, make the success. Other people will see that and then want to join, and it will grow organically. We have never seen this grow by mandate. ever. Remember at the beginning we were saying that you can't make innovation happen, you can just increase the chances that are happening. And then I said there's a set of conditions you can create to make it happen. Well, the other thing that makes innovation happen, so there's conditions. The other side of it is what I call force vectors. It sounds, very Star Warsy, but it's a way for us to measure kind of what we're doing. But it just means that something has to be pushing on people. People don't change just because you tell them to. So there's 4 key drivers of change. 4 reasons that people will either change their behavior or what they're doing. The first one is there's a crisis. Okay? There's something that's happened that's precipitated a conversation that has led us to say, we have to solve this. Crises are the best way to make change happen because it aligns people the quickest and the focus is the sharpest. The second way to create change is by mandate. You have a new law. By such and such a date, everyone must comply and do X. Could be pica placa. We have a new rule that says on these days you can drive if you've got this license plate and you can drive on this plate. Everyone conforms. Everyone changes their behavior based on a mandate. The third driver of change is evolution. We change because if we don't survive. Or the reason we use, touch-tone telephones now is because rotary phones don't exist. They just don't. So we change our behavior based on just what is necessary for our survival. But the last one is the most interesting because it's a unique human one, which is just desire. We change because we want to change. It's every high school student's being in high school. You end up, dyeing your hair black and wearing, black fingernail polish because you want to belong, because you want to feel wanted. It's a basic human need. So desire, which is really what Steve Jobs did with Apple. No one needed an iPad. No one needed an iPhone. There were other phones that were equal or if not better in terms of utility out there. But he made you want it so badly, you had to have it. It said something about you and your status. So desire is a wonderful, wonderful motivator. So as you work with either your internal culture inside of your companies or whether you work as a community culture, making it a desirous place to be is wonderful because ecosystems just don't happen or innovation systems don't happen. They're highly self-selecting. People choose to go to the Silicon Valley. It's not as if we have more creatives there per capita because it's just random. No, it's there because people have chosen to get on planes and people have traveled very large geographical and social distances to get there. And one of the reasons that it has this high serial nature, in other words, they have so much success disproportionate to other places, is because the fact that these people overcame large geographical and social hurdles to get there are the very ingredients that help make them phenomenal entrepreneurs. So again, they self-selected themselves. They're like sea turtles, going back to their home. They just have hybrid vigor built into them. But you can do the same thing in your community. But the first thing is, how are we going to make our companies, our communities, desirous places to do it? As our kids graduate school, how are we going to make sure that we've got the opportunities for them? And it's just not just opportunities for opportunity's sake, but opportunities where they're going to make a choice to be here as opposed to being somewhere else. It's a pretty important question. They feel very organic, they're raw walls, because a lot of these innovators aren't really mesmerized by the trappings of traditional kind of wealth. They're too young. And so they really look for authenticity. They look for things that kind of resonate with where they're at in their own lives. And so the places have to kind of feel real to them, and they have to speak to them on their own terms, which is why there's nothing magic about the 4 walls of any accelerator. People get too enamored. Again, we said 99% of innovation's invisible, is that the 4 walls mean absolutely nothing. They're just places to work. And people often ask me, very reductionist, they say, if there's only one thing we can do in a community to be more innovative, what would that one thing be? And I say, build coffee houses. Because there's only one reality of entrepreneurs. They need caffeine and they need broadband. They need bandwidth. And if you can give them both, you can do absolutely amazing things. And you're laughing, but one of our very small cities in the Silicon Valley One of our cities in the Silicon Valley that no one had ever heard of or realized was a city called San Leandro, because it's not San Francisco and it's not Berkeley or Emeryville. And what they did is they convinced one of the broadband providers to bring in very, very what we call fat pipe, really large bandwidth capabilities into this community. And almost overnight, they're the center of innovation activity because all the entrepreneurs want to be there because they can do 3D printing, things that consume lots of bandwidth. So they created the world's largest connected serial 3D printing facility, where they can now do 3D printing where it would take an individual 3D printer 5 or 6 hours to print something. They can print in a couple of minutes. And this is something I actually learned by experience, because we had actually started doing the opposite. We fell in love with interesting technologies. I can tell you from experience that phenomenal entrepreneurs with an okay idea will almost always find a way to make it successful. Okay entrepreneurs with great ideas almost never succeed, unless they're just lucky. And so we weight the talent and the team far greater, which is why one of the companies that I'm working on right now is a way of assessing the potential of teams, entrepreneurs, so we can actually figure that out. So there was an interview I did for the book there's a gentleman named Ron Conway in the Silicon Valley, and he's the most successful angel investor in the Silicon Valley. So he was the very first investor in Google, eBay, PayPal, Twitter, Zynga, Square, and Facebook, before any venture capitalist did. So the question is, why is your pattern recognition so much better than anyone else's? Because almost every VC, with Google, every venture capitalist passed on it originally, because Wall Street had already said, well, search has been optimized. Yahoo and Alta Vista have already done more with it. And 2 students out of Stanford, I doubt, have cracked the code. The other thing is they said, we're going to make money by selling advertising. People said, that's just stupid. That's just a dumb idea. But there was something that Ron saw, and people like Ram Shriram, who's another successful angel investor, saw in this company. So I asked him what it was. And he says, I usually know within 5 minutes of sitting down with an entrepreneur if they're extraordinary versus merely excellent. And it's not easy to do. He goes, I invest in extraordinary people, not just excellent people. He said, but I've got a pattern recognition. I've got a human algorithm that knows the difference. Now, I have no idea whether the idea is going to be successful. We've got to work on it. But on average, there was a report that was done called the Startup Genome Report. It looked at 20 years of startups. And it said, what are the common elements of success? Are there any common themes between successful companies versus unsuccessful ones? And they found that there definitely were. So they found, for instance, teams with 2 co-founders are more likely to succeed than teams with just a single co-founder, because they play off of one another. And they found but they also found that companies that, and this word is overused, pivot 2 to 3 times are more likely to succeed. And what pivoting means is they change something fundamental about their business model or their approach 2 to 3 times before they actually find what their good business model is. They change things. In fact, Instagram, very successful company, if you go and look at what they originally did, had absolutely nothing to do with photo sharing. It wasn't even the same business. They completely changed their business model and were successful. And so you have to, one, have exceptional talent to be able to not either be stubborn or to be able to recognize when they need to change course. And that is an attribute of an extraordinary person versus an excellent person. That's why we tend to hire. In fact, some of the great incubators in the Silicon Valley, there's an incubator called Y Combinator, which is by far the most successful of the incubators. Their companies today, even though they've only been around since 2005, the net value of their companies is $30 billion that they've put through. But what they found is that they used to only, when people applied, they would take people, companies into it. Now what they'll do is if they find an extraordinary entrepreneur and his idea is terrible, they'll take him into the program knowing that extraordinary people are actually hard to find. And so they don't want to lose them. So we're going to keep the extraordinary people, and we'll find a good idea for you to work on, or we'll iterate your idea. You're laughing because what Microsoft and Facebook have Googled now, they're working with a company called Quid, which is an analytics company in the Valley, to figure out where all the talent is moving. They're looking at things like LinkedIn and Facebook to find out how talent. So when Jack Dorsey leaves Twitter and starts his company Square, and all the people in his network begin moving around, they can actually visualize that. And they're doing it for, there's a term called acqui-hiring, which is you acquire merely for the people, not for the technology. What? You acquire a company not just for the technology, but for the people actually in the company. They're far more valuable than the technology they're developing. It's called acqui-hiring. And so people, the next big battleground is not for technologies, it's for people. And that's what all these companies are doing. Google spends millions of dollars a year trying to identify the best talent that they can, and they will very aggressively go after it. In fact, they'll pay them ridiculous sums of money, realizing, because they've done studies that shows that the return on investment of extraordinary people far outweighs than just finding someone who can just do the job. One of the experiments we're doing in California is we're creating an institute for innovation leadership, or high potential leadership. So there was a study that we read around engineers, and it showed that engineers exist on the spectrum psychologically between autism and psychosis, being psychotic. But what we were seeing in places like the Silicon Valley is a lot of these vision-led entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Larry Ellison of Oracle, Elon Musk. They were all more on the side of Asperger's and autism, very introverted. But yet those are not traits that we generally look for in leaders. Did you? Autism, or there's a condition called Asperger's. And so what you do is you see people who won't make eye contact, and they'll kind of look down, or they'll be shy. In fact, if you look at a lot of the early interviews with Mark Zuckerberg, you can watch him. He has trouble making eye contact, and he'll sweat. You know, he'll look down and to the side. In fact, we joke that the extroverts and the introverts in the Silicon Valley, you can tell the difference, because the introverts just stare and look at their shoes all day, but the extroverts look at your shoes. Yeah, so it's just kind of shades of gray, that we all kind of sit like this. But getting to your point is there are ways we can help them. So one of the products that we created as a result of that, teaching in our business school, I felt we were giving students a lot of the right skills. But as an entrepreneur, there was one skill I felt that was absolutely the most critical skill, and our universities weren't teaching it. And that is the ability to tell great stories. Because I can have someone write a business plan, I can have someone put a financial spreadsheet together. But if I'm the entrepreneur, I can't have anyone tell my story. So what I did is I went to Pixar, and I spent 4 weeks at Pixar working with their storytelling team and saying, how can I use what you're doing at Pixar to teach engineers and entrepreneurs how to be better storytellers? Okay? Yeah. Look at Elon Musk, look at Zuckerberg, they all are phenomenal. Steve Jobs, phenomenal storyteller. Because innovation is all about the future. It's about what has not yet happened. And you've got to get us excited about the future. You've got to get us to remember you. You've got to get us to care about you. And absolutely important, you've got to get us to act. You've got to get us to do something differently than we were doing before. And that's the power of storytelling. So when you're talking about what are the tools, the skills you can give these people that they don't necessarily have, you can teach them how to be better communicators. Not just how to put a presentation or a pitch deck together, but actually how to talk to somebody. So don't just give me facts. This is how much money we're going to make. This is our margins. Get me excited. Get me emotionally excited in you and the opportunity. And if you can do that, you have probably a 3x better chance of getting funded, getting people to follow you into your team than you would if we didn't. Yeah. Don't try to change everything. So if I was going to recommend for an organization like you, start really, really small. And there's one of two things you can do. Either, and this should be with Marcella, one of the things we can do is, there's a program I created, which is an intrapreneurship program. What we did is, large corporations said, look, we don't have the culture to do the kinds of stuff you're talking about. But we have people inside of our company who have really good ideas. We just can't support them. It's called entrepreneurship. It'd be great if you could take some of those people, and let's say you set what's called a grand challenge inside your company. These are 3 problems we're trying to solve inside of our company, or 3 problems that we've kind of looked to the market to solve. We would like some of our own internal entrepreneurs to work with Connect, and we can help them think, so it creates a very safe place where they're not disrupting your business. They can think about all these things, but they can develop them to the point when they bring them back inside your business, they're very well thought out. They're the kinds of things that you could put before your board, and they can explain the exact business rationale, why it's good for the business, what the economic impact, the social impact, all that is. And that's a very safe way for organizations that want to begin changing can do it by working with organizations that can kind of make that change. The other way is if you wanted to kind of do it internally, start with a really, really small group and kind of give them a different set of rules and don't make them accountable to the rest of the system. In other words, just assume that you're going to lose whatever money you put into that and just use it as a place to do that. But really what's critical is to make sure that the stories about what happens, particularly the stuff that doesn't work, the stories about the failures are actually more important because of the knowledge they create than actually what does work. So have this kind of open sharing. It's kind of what we did. I studied medicine, and we would do in the hospital, we would do called M&Ms, which is morbidity and mortality. So after you'd have a surgery that went bad, you would actually have an open conference where you talk about why the surgery went bad and what we learned from it so that everyone could actually learn from that. It is. And organizations that actually encourage that open sharing advance so much more because, one, it makes people less afraid to actually share their failures. But failures just by themselves are not good. Failures are great if you can actually learn from them and if you create the ability to actually say, we're fine, as long as you tell us what are the 2 things or 3 things you learned from that and how could those lessons actually be now applied to the way we do business. That's very positive.
Tenemos ahorita el 29 de mayo una misión que se llama Misión Bogotá Innovadora, que es a conocer algunas de estas joyas de innovación que hay en Bogotá. Y es muy interesante porque digamos, hay unos hubs de emprendimiento muy chéveres, laboratorios de empresas grandes, vamos a ir a Belgrove, a los laboratorios de los Andes. Es súper chévere, los que han ido a las misiones de Connect saben que realmente son espectaculares y pues contribuyen a ese cambio de cultura, estar uno un día sumergido en estos temas y conociendo este tipo de personas, entonces cordialmente invitados el 29 de mayo. También, como decía mucho Greg Springboard, que es el programa de emprendimiento, una de las maneras que algunas empresas han empezado a cambiar su cultura de innovación es que mandan ejecutivos a ser mentores de los emprendedores o de los ejecutivos. Ahí está, hay varios del foro de presidentes que son mentores, tenemos un grupo como de 100 mentores y realmente participar en ese panel, en esos paneles donde uno le está llevando a los emprendedores es una experiencia muy enriquecedora para uno. Primero, los pares son muy interesantes, pero ver a estos jóvenes y poderlos ayudar, muchas veces aprende uno más de ellos que ellos de uno, pero realmente el que se anime y que le parezca chévere, pues muy invitados. Tenemos una cantidad de cosas ahí, para que estén en contacto, y ahora Gloria y Rosario son nuestros, o son su contacto dentro de Connect, están yendo ambas al consejo directivo. Entonces pues yo espero que haya muchas más iniciativas y pues no me voy a quedar aquí contándole todo lo que estamos haciendo, pero quisiera contarles todo. Ahorita estamos en un proceso de especialización productiva para Bogotá.
No, realmente no se pierdan estar más cerquita de ayudarnos a que más miembros del foro se cerquita con él. Creo que es una oportunidad de muchas, no va a suceder tantas veces en simultánea y creo que vale la pena que el foro pueda ser parte dinámica de lo que está sucediendo y lo que se está haciendo desde